So welcome everybody. So I'm Edgar Whitley, and I'm doing the talk today about some thoughts and some views on what is self-sovereign identity and how that fits into the broader digital identity landscape. A little bit about me. I've been researching digital identity for over 20 years. Those who are a little bit older may remember the previous Labour government had plans for a digital identity system in the UK, and together with colleagues at LSE, literally just over 20 years ago, almost 21 years ago, we wrote a big project about the bill and its implications, and I've been involved with studying digital identity systems from that point onwards. Various roles advising government, particularly in the UK, but also internationally. And of particular relevance for this talk is my role as the former co-chair of the Privacy and Consumer Advisory Group, PCAG, for gov.uk One Login, the government-issued digital ID system. I'm also a member of both the DCMS and the DCIT College of Experts, as an opportunity to provide academic advice to those two government departments. DCIT obviously with digital ID as one of its key remits, but also DCMS with culture, media and sport and related activities. As I was thinking about what I would say on this talk, I was looking for a nice example to illustrate some of the practical challenges that modern digital or modern ID systems face. And yesterday, the FT ran with this story of a data leak at the Abu Dhabi Finance Summit, which exposed a whole load of personal detail about politicians and business leaders, including scans of more than 700 passports and state identity documents that were stored on an unprotected cloud storage server associated with the event. And amongst the scanned documents that were found on this website, it was included documents from David Cameron, the former British Prime Minister, Anthony Scaramucci, the former White House Communications Director, and a whole host of other people as well. And at one level, this is just a typical don't put data in an unsecured server somewhere on the cloud, but also it raises really important questions about what kinds of identity documents do you need, what kinds of identity documents do you need to store details of, etc. Why would a Finance Week event need a scan of passport details of all of the attendees? And that raises some background kind of concepts. And of course, passport scans can be very valuable for doing all sorts of fraud, because that's one of the typical documents that you use to open bank accounts, etc., or to do personalized phishing attacks on them. But as I say, that raises an important question of, well, what do these documents do? What do these documents share? And very often the talk is that they are identity documents, but increasingly, I think what most organizational contexts are really interested in are attributes. So just a few examples of both identities and attributes. So if I have a document that can confirm that I am Edgar Whitley, that can be helpful in certain contexts when you need to know whether or not who the person is that's interacting with you. Although for a lunch and learn talk, you might not care who I am, just whether I say interesting things and relevant things, etc. In other contexts, you might be interested in knowing an attribute about me. For example, do I have a PhD, and where was the PhD granted from? Do I have a right to work in the UK, which has been a particularly big policy issue? In other contexts, it might just be, am I a human rather than a bot or an AI-generated image? And if I'm playing online games, you might want to know whether or not it's true that I am Tharg in the world of Warcraft. And so that distinction between identities and attributes is an important one that we'll come back to later on. If these are things that we are interested in collecting and sharing and using for real kind of activity purposes, then the choices of the identity architectures that we have become increasingly important. And broadly speaking, there's been kind of three main phases by which identity architectures typically have been implemented. The first phase is very much a centralized identity model, typically controlled by a single authority, often the nation state. That organization centric approach means that the government or a particular organization will issue the identity credential. A classic example is the passport that the UK government issues to all UK citizens who have applied for one and satisfy the requirements. Historically, these credentials were often paper-based, and so if you needed to prove that I really am Edgar Whitley, you would also have details of my date of birth on the printed page of the passport. If I was using my UK driving license, it would also include my home address. So they're not particularly good for controlling what kinds of data you disclose over and above what you need for the transaction. And there's a real risk of tracking and surveillance of the activities, because every time you're checking the passport, you are potentially telling the government that your passport is being checked. And another big concern is the repudiation of identity claims. So if the government does not like me, and this can happen on various places around the world, then the government could just say, no, we haven't issued a passport to Edgar Whitley, and therefore all of my identity claims get disconnected from the body that issues them. The second phase of identity architectures is more federated, where rather than a single body issuing the identity document, you might have a range or a federation of providers who will provide that identity credential, often interoperable, so it doesn't matter who within the federation provides that. Makes tracking surveillance of identity activities much more difficult, and it's equally more difficult to potentially repudiate the identity claims, because you could apply to somebody else in the federation. The third phase is self-sovereign identities, and this really moves it from control by the organization to control by the individual. The individual is the root of all identity and attribute claims. They often the individual can then decide, give consent over which attributes are going to be shared. I don't think you need to know my address, so I'm not going to share my address with you. And therefore, you can really technologically minimize the amount of data that is disclosed, that therefore being much more privacy friendly. Number of people have tried to kind of define what is meant by self-sovereign identities, and this particular one has 10 kind of key principles. Users must have an independent existence. They must be able to control their identities. They must be able to access their own data. Systems and algorithms must be transparent. The identities must be long-lived rather than just for a particular transaction. Information and services about identity must be transportable, widely usable as possible. The user must agree to the use of their identity. Disclosure of claims about attributes must be minimized, and the rights of the users must be protected. Now, some of these are all good principles. They're not necessarily automatic design features of digital identity systems. Some of these are kind of broader governance kinds of concerns, but they do often lead to some interesting technical architecture choices. So if we take the idea of users must have an independent existence, taking the logic of we don't like the idea that the state might decide that you don't exist, then certain versions of decentralized, of self-sovereign identities talk about introducing decentralized identifiers, DIDs, which is a kind of a globally unique identifier, a number that only is associated with you. It's completely under your control, and it's not dependent on permission from, for example, the government. So you can create a DID, and that is completely separate from what the government thinks about you or whatever it might be. And when this version was first introduced, there was a lot of interest about storing this kind of thing on a blockchain, where the blockchain would include details of your DID, but also the public keys that allow people to read the encrypted data that you have about yourself. Of course, it also means that you have your own private keys that are linked to the blockchain. And there are interesting usability questions. I would hate to have to explain to my elderly mother how she manages her private keys to use this blockchain-based technology. But we'll come back to that briefly at the end. In terms of attribute disclosure, disclosure of claims must be minimized. So typically this is phrased as a yes/no question. So rather than saying, if the answer to the question, are you over 18, for example, to buy age-restricted materials, is not, here is my date of birth, do the calculation of 18 years from today, the answer to that is either yes or no. You're over 18 or you're not over 18. Are you entitled to work in the UK? Yes, you are. No, you're not. If you're not, we're not going to employ you. If you have disability and mobility issues, are you entitled to a blue badge? The answer is yes or no. A doctor hopefully has determined that, not, oh, I've got a bit of a bad back and a sore foot, etc., etc. This is the kind of nice illustration of disclosure minimization, but there are some questions that are a little bit more contentious, perhaps where the time of the question needs to be part of that. So with the whole discussion about trans rights in the UK, are you a woman, might be based on what was your biological sex at birth versus how do you identify in 2026. So there may be a time element, so it's not a simple yes, no, it's a yes in 2026, but not necessarily at the time that you were born. And the other fun one is, are you a police officer? If a random person stops you in the street and asks you to, I know, empty your pockets, first question you should be asking is, are you a police officer? And only the police officer can be able to say, yes, they are. If, however, that police officer is going in, infiltrating a gang, and the gang says, are you a police officer? The police officer ought to have the discretion to be able to say, no, I'm not, because otherwise their undercover operation falls by the wayside. Now, technically, this kind of selective or disclosed controlled disclosure is not intrinsic to self-sovereign identities. You could have a much more centralized digital identity solution that also allows that selective disclosure, but often it's kind of seen as a benefit of self-sovereign IDs to have that more selective control, because you're building a digital first product rather than a paper document or whatever it might be. Another challenge is that you need the relying party to agree to that minimal disclosure. So if you are buying an age-restricted product from the supermarket, the ideal path is that the supermarket only asks you for proof that you are over 18. And if you are, then you're allowed to buy that age-restricted product. But you can imagine situations, for example, if it's sales of alcohol, where there may be a good societal health monitoring kind of thing, where we want to also know whether or not men or women are buying more alcohol in the supermarket or whatever it might be. And all of a sudden, that minimal disclosure, the question is, are you over 18, might now also be, and are you male or female? So it can get a little bit more complicated in those ways. Another key feature about self-sovereign IDs is that the data that you want needs to come from an authoritative source, something that has legitimacy as being the basis of truth for the particular claims, and those attributes can then be stored in the digital credential that you are providing. So who is the authoritative source for I am Edgar Whitley? Possibly my birth certificate, which is a government department. Who is the authoritative source for where I got my PhD from? Well, that would definitely be LSE. Who is the authoritative source for I have a right to work in the UK? That's Home Office regulations. Who is the authoritative source for I am a human, not a bot? Well, that might be the company that issued the credential. Who is the authoritative source for I am Tharg in World of Warcraft? Almost certainly not LSE or the Home Office, but World of Warcraft is a perfectly legitimate one for doing that. That then raises a really practical, real-world question about how you release authoritative data. And this is why I'm not convinced that the blockchain route is necessarily the ultimate way forward. Because if I am the Home Office with a list of who has the right to work in the UK, it's not immediately obvious that just showing me my blockchain hosted DID will be sufficient for the Home Office to give those attributes to somebody to store in their document. The kind of most current implementation of self-sovereign IDs is through the notion of verifiable credentials, which typically have three main components plus a governance activity. So the issuers are the people who have the authoritative source for the various claims. Those claims are then stored on the verifiable credential, and those claims can then be passed to a verifier. And the verifier can check through encryption methods that the claim was issued by the issuer and that is owned by the holder, but without that checking, that phoning home, going back to the original authoritative source. So if the authoritative source digitally signs it with the issuer then digitally signs it onto the holder, then you've got the ability to confirm these different kinds of claims without necessarily going any further into the background. So you disconnect the surveillance capabilities, characteristics from the usable practices of using the verifiable credentials. Couple of last questions, and I've just hit my 18 minutes. Are digital wallets the most effective way of implementing large-scale verifiable credentials, self-sovereign identities? In the UK at the moment, there's still a little bit of uncertainty as to whether only government wallets can host the data that's issued by an authoritative government source, or could it go also to other digital wallets? What practical constraints limit the widespread adoption of self-sovereign identities? How much of this is a great technology solution that a small number of technologists who have confidence in the technology will be able to do, and everybody else will really struggle and therefore it won't take off? And then the final one, how do you balance concerns about individual control with societal constraints? The government had been thinking about doing targeted enforcement of right to work checks, which means keeping a record of every time that privacy friendly credential is being used to prove your right to work. That's creating an audit trail which goes back to much more of that centralized control rather than the much more distributed privacy friendly self-sovereign ID approach. So with apologies for running over slightly, here are my contact details, and I'm happy to take any questions.